Welcome in to Steelers Talk. I'm your host, Jack Sperry, and happy Conference Championship Sunday, Steelers Nation. Unfortunately, of course, the Steelers are not playing tonight, and obviously the goal is to eventually get there in the future. And hopefully, our new head coach, Mike McCarthy, is going to be able to get us, back to some AFC Championship games in the future. As he was hired as the next head coach of the Pittsburgh Steelers yesterday. I want to thank you guys for all of your support yesterday. We went live. It was an absolutely awesome live show. There's definitely mixed feelings about this hire, but I think, the best way to approach this moving forward as a fan base, whether we agree with the hire or not, is to get behind our new head coach and have an open mind and try and find the best way forward. Because whether we like the hire or not, he is the head coach, and if we want to remain, fans of this football team and all that different stuff, and I know I am, I'm going to look to try and make this the best it can possibly be. And I'm going to continue to talk about the ways that, we can try and strive to, be a good football team moving forward and try to, take the next step as a football club here, going from, a team that has made the playoffs 3 straight years, has gotten double-digit win seasons the last 3 years. And, there's a pretty good foundation in place already on this roster, I truly believe. And I do think Mike McCarthy, for some of his faults and, some of the things that are, understandably frustrating about this hire, he does bring a pretty decent history of developing quarterback talent. He does bring an offense that still produces results in the modern NFL. And, I think that he does bring an upgrade schematically on the offensive side of the ball to the Pittsburgh Steelers. But what we're going to be talking about on today's show, guys, is the defensive coordinator hire, because I cannot stress enough how important this hire is going to be for the short-term success in particular of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Because if he makes the right hire at defensive coordinator, that means that I think schematically the Steelers will be in the best spot they've been in many seasons. Because as we know, Mike Tomlin, both on offense and defense, the scheme got a little bit stale. Under his coordinators did not make the best coordinator hires. If Mike McCarthy can build a better staff than Mike Tomlin was able to here in Pittsburgh, there's a chance that the McCarthy era can be more successful, especially to start his Steelers tenure here, than it was in the final seasons of Mike Tomlin. And today we're going to be talking about all the defensive coordinator candidates I think are worth mentioning. Obviously, there's some candidates that could be coming out of the woodwork here, but I wanted to talk about first the guys that have connections to McCarthy that could be in line to at least get an interview, if not get the job itself. And then I'll talk about some other guys that I would personally like to see as a defensive coordinator hire that don't necessarily have any connections to Mike McCarthy. So make sure you guys click that subscribe button if you haven't already. Later today, actually, I'm going to be putting out another video about offensive coordinator candidates. I wanted to do defensive coordinator candidates first because I think this hire is much more important, because I'm guessing Big Mike is going to be calling plays on the offensive side of the ball here in Pittsburgh. So the OC hire, not as important as the DC hire. But make sure you guys click that subscribe button because I will be doing an OC candidates video later, probably in between the 2 conference championship games this evening. So I want to start here by saying that obviously that this hire at defensive coordinator is going to be absolutely huge, okay? And the reason why I say that is not only because McCarthy's an offensive-minded head coach and he needs somebody to run his defense, but this is a team with the way that it's set up, with how much money is invested and how much veteran talent exists on the defensive side of the ball. If Pittsburgh is going to be successful and they're going to take the next step in the short term, which I do believe is the goal here in Pittsburgh, like Art Rooney II, Omar Khan have made it abundantly clear. Their goal is to try and compete for a championship every single year. So if you think they're going to rip this thing down and do a true rebuild, I don't think that's the approach they're going to take. The approach they're going to take is, we're going to try and win the Super Bowl next year. And if the Steelers, especially with the quarterback options that they have available to them next year, up to and including Aaron Rodgers. Like, I don't know if any of those quarterback options are good enough to carry you to a Super Bowl. If you are going to truly be in the mix this time next year, you're going to have a defense that is top 5 in the NFL, maybe top 3. Like, they're going to have to be of the caliber of a Seattle Seahawks defense. They're going to have to be of the caliber of a Houston Texans defense. They're going to have to be of the caliber of a Denver Broncos defense. And and frankly, the Rams defense even, the Rams defense is also very good. Last 4 teams standing have really good defenses, and if the Steelers want to get off on the right foot here in the Mike McCarthy era, he's going to have to bring in a defensive coordinator that can get the most out of the Steelers' defensive personnel, which is very good. I mean, this defense, like TJ Watt, Alex Highsmith, Nick Herbig, Cam Hayward, Derek Harmon, Keanu Benson, Peyton Wilson, very talented player. You still got Jalen Ramsey, who can still be one of the best big nickel players in the league. Joey Porter Jr. is a shutdown guy. Deshaun Elliott will be back next year. There's a lot to work with here in Pittsburgh on the defensive side of the ball, and I think we can all agree Mike Tomlin and Terrell Austin were not able to get the most out of this group over the last several seasons. But if Mike McCarthy can bring in somebody that can get the most out of this group, and this group can, take that next step and become a truly elite defense, and you pair that with an offense that, adds a couple good receivers, maybe Aaron Rodgers comes back for another season. I think we all agree Rodgers was certainly a serviceable quarterback this year, and if you give him a couple more like legitimately good separators next to DK Metcalf at the receiver position, I think this offense, could be better than it was last year. And, if you have an improved offense and an elite defense next season, we could have a shot to be a better football team next year than we were this past season in the first year of a Mike McCarthy regime. I truly do believe that. Another thing to keep in mind is that, when Mike McCarthy's had good defensive coordinators, he usually does very well. In Dallas, he started his Cowboy career with Mike Nolan as his defensive coordinator. They did not have a good first season there with the Cowboys. But then he hires Dan Quinn to be his defensive coordinator. He's there for 3 years, and in all 3 years, they win 12 games. They win multiple division championships. So, when I look at, McCarthy's kind of situation, if he has a good defensive coordinator that can help him, have a lot of success and get those double-digit win seasons and put his teams in contention to win division championships. So if he gets this hire right, I truly believe the Steelers have a pretty decent chance of short-term success and probably maybe even a better chance to win in the playoffs than they have over the last several seasons here in Pittsburgh. So let's start with my candidates here. And the first one that I want to talk about, and by the way, we're going to be starting with the candidates that have connections to Mike McCarthy. We'll start with Karl Scott, the pass game coordinator and the DBs coach for the Seattle Seahawks. Under Mike Macdonald, my guess is he would bring over a Macdonald big nickel style defense. And Scott has done a really good job with those DBs in Seattle. That secondary is absolutely awesome. And the reason why he's connected to McCarthy is not because he's ever worked for Mike, but because one of Mike's former employees, Arden Durd, who was his defensive line coach in Dallas, is now the defensive coordinator there in Seattle. And I'm guessing if Mike, gives a call to Arden and says, hey, who on your staff, could be a really good, young, modern defensive play caller, I think Karl Scott is the guy that would probably get the recommendation. Obviously he's worked with the secondary there in Seattle. He's their pass game coordinator on defense, so he works with Arden every single day in terms of the defensive game planning. And he is a younger guy, and he's a really well-respected dude around the league. I think Karl Scott would be a really good hire because he could bring that modern, big nickel, Mike Macdonald style defense here to Pittsburgh, and I think that that's a style of defense that would work really well with the personnel that we have here in the Steel City. So Karl Scott, first name on that list. Another one that is very popular and has been connected to Mike McCarthy quite a bit here is Al Harris, who has already gotten defensive coordinator interviews with the Commanders and the Packers. could be more on the way here as well. But, in terms of the scheme that Al Harris would probably bring in, it'd probably be something similar to what Dan Quinn runs in Washington, single high, very aggressive, multiple front defense where they play a lot of man, they blitz a lot, and they try and play, that single high brand of football where you kind of force the opposing defense to or the opposing offense, I should say, try to, beat your man coverage down the field. You're not going to give them anything easy on the ground in terms of the run game. You're going to play single high safety. That's the type of stuff that they ran in Dallas under Dan Quinn. And then right now, Al Harris is the pass game coordinator under Dennis Allen in Chicago, another very aggressive defensive coordinator that runs a lot of bump and run, press man coverage. So I think if Al Harris is the hire, and by the way, he was the DB's coach for Mike McCarthy there in 2024, his final season there in Dallas. He was also his assistant head coach, by the way. If he comes over here to Pittsburgh, I think it's going to be a very aggressive, very man-heavy, and very blitz-heavy offense. So, keep that in mind with an Al Harris possibility at DC. Then Joe Whitt Jr., another guy that's a big McCarthy dude. He's been with McCarthy for most of his coaching career in the National Football League, starting with Green Bay, then in Dallas, and then Joe Whitt Jr. follows Dan Quinn to Washington to be his defensive coordinator, helps that team go to an NFC Championship game just 2 years ago. He was seen as one of the up-and-coming defensive coordinators after his first year in Washington, and unfortunately, there's a lot of injuries, and frankly, they did not build that Commanders defensive roster all that well this past season, and he ends up getting his play calling duties taken away, and eventually he gets fired. So he's currently up for grabs. I would guess Joe Whitt Jr. would be a part of this staff in some capacity if McCarthy doesn't hire him as a defensive coordinator. I could easily see him being a secondaries coach here in Pittsburgh. That's what he did before Al Harris got to Dallas. So something to keep in mind there. Another connection potentially is Leslie Frazier, who's a long-time defensive coordinator in this league. He's a former head coach of the Minnesota Vikings. So McCarthy knows Leslie a little bit there. He would run, either a Mike McDonald, big nickel style defense. He's currently the assistant head coach there with McDonald in Seattle. Or he would run something akin to like a Sean McDermott, 4-2 split field, 2 high safeties, heavy quarters, heavy cover 6, style defense that we saw there in Buffalo, where he was the defensive coordinator for many seasons. So, even though Leslie's a little bit of an older guy, do think he would bring a modern scheme to the table if he were to be hired. Another guy that has a connection to McCarthy is Patrick Graham, the former defensive coordinator for the Raiders for the last several seasons. And, the thing that I like about Patrick Graham, guys, is that he's very multiple. Like, he will change his defensive scheme and what he likes to do tendency-wise based on the talent that he has on his defense for that given year. And that's something that he learned from Bill Belichick when he worked in New England. I was really impressed with Patrick Graham. I think it was the first year of the Joe Judge regime there in New York, where Patrick Graham ran a really good defense with not a whole lot of high-end talent. And, I think that he's kept that Raiders defense afloat at times. They haven't been a great defense over the last several years, but they've really only had Max Crosby, and that's it. But he briefly worked under McCarthy in Green Bay in McCarthy's final season there with the Packers before he got fired. So they do have a previous connection, and I know Patrick Graham is a very respected guy in league circles. Could certainly see Patrick Graham being the hire here in Pittsburgh. Then another guy that has a connection to McCarthy is Jason Simmons, who's currently the pass game coordinator for the Washington Commanders. He worked with Joe Whitt Jr., and he was actually there when Ron Rivera was still there back in 2020. My guess is he would run a very similar system to what Dan Quinn runs in Washington, which is a multiple front, aggressive style, single high defense with a lot of single high man coverage, with a lot of blitzing, a lot of stunts, stuff like that. They like to move people around on the defensive line. And Jason Simmons worked for McCarthy for 9 years in Green Bay, so he certainly has that connection. He's a very well-respected guy in the league. He's never been a defensive coordinator, but he has interviewed for DC jobs for multiple years. Never got a job, however, and he was also a Steelers cornerback back in the day during the Cowher era. I believe it was from 1998 through 2001. Where he played for the Pittsburgh Steelers. So his connection to the team, along with his connection to McCarthy, make Jason Simmons a possibility as well. But now I want to shift focus here to some defensive coordinator candidates that I personally would like to bring in, but really don't have any connection to Mike McCarthy. And something to keep in mind with McCarthy, guys, is that when he was in Dallas, he hired a lot of people he had no previous connection to. Guys like Dan Quinn and, John Fassel and a lot of these other guys that, that he hired to be on his coaching staff that he had never worked with before. So it seems like McCarthy does have an open mind to hiring people he hasn't worked with before. And there's some pretty darn good defensive coordinator candidates that are outside of his sort of bubble. And because McCarthy is such a respected guy in the National Football League, I do think that the Steelers defensive coordinator position under Mike McCarthy is a very attractive job for prospective defensive coordinators. So we'll start with Raheem Morris, who I think if Mike Tomlin was still here and they would have let Teryl Austin go, I think Raheem Morris would have been the defensive coordinator of the Pittsburgh Steelers, because I don't think he's going to get a head coaching job. He's got, he's still, in the running for the Cardinals job technically, but he's expected to probably, end up being a defensive coordinator somewhere. And, if you want somewhere where he can, I'm sure Mike Tomlin would give a great recommendation for him to come to Pittsburgh. And for a guy like Mike McCarthy, who's an offensive-minded head coach, and you're trying to find your version of Steve Spagnuolo, okay? Like if Mike McCarthy is trying to be like Andy Reid here in Pittsburgh, then he's got to find his Steve Spagnuolo. And for a guy like Raheem Morris, who's a really good defensive coordinator, knows defensive football, runs a modern NFL defense, but he's been a head coach multiple times already and has failed. So, the chances of him getting poached are, not very high. So if you can get a guy like Raheem Morris, who Jalen Ramsey absolutely loves, he's called him the best coach he's ever had and the best coach in the NFL even, I could certainly see Raheem being somebody that would like to come to Pittsburgh potentially. Now he's got a lot of connections to other places, Washington, Green Bay, LA, a lot of different places are going to be interested in Raheem Morris. But, with this opportunity to coach, a defense as talented as Pittsburgh's and to have full control and autonomy over the defense, with Mike McCarthy as his head coach, it wouldn't shock me if Raheem Morris is at least a little bit interested in the Steelers job. Another guy that I'd be interested in is Daronte Jones, who's the current pass game coordinator under Brian Flores in Minnesota. And Flores actually credits Daronte Jones with a lot of the exotic pre-snap disguises and post-snap rotations that you see from the Vikings defense week in and week out. So you guys know how much I love Flores' defense and how, they use the hot quarter stuff and cover zero, and they do these crazy exotic disguises and post snap rotations, and it's just such a modern defense. I think it's one of the best defenses in the league, and to bring over Flores' understudy here in Daronte Jones to be the next defensive coordinator, you get Flores' defense without getting maybe the prickliness or the attitude that it seems to turn a lot of people off to Brian Flores. And obviously Flo is already signed his extension in Minnesota. He's not going anywhere. And Daronte Jones has gotten a number of defensive coordinator interviews from around the league. The Dallas Cowboys interviewed him. The Packers interviewed him. The Washington Commanders are interviewing him. So he's a very popular defensive coordinator candidate around the league. And I think he'd be an awesome fit for the Pittsburgh Steelers because I think this Flores-style defense would work so well here in Pittsburgh. Also, Jim Leonhard, the Denver pass game coordinator, is still not hired, obviously, because he's still coaching. He's going to be coaching this afternoon in the AFC Championship game. But, he's got a lot of interest from around the league. I know a lot of Steelers fans really like him as a candidate as well. And, I think they run a really good defense there in Denver. I would certainly be open to Jim Leonhard being the next defensive coordinator here. Anthony Weaver is another name to consider. Like, he was somebody that the team did interview for the head coaching position. I think a lot of people kind of realized that, oh, they only interviewed 3 people in person, Brian Flores, Anthony Weaver to, fulfill their obligations in terms of the Rooney Rule. And then they ended up hiring, Mike McCarthy as their head coach. But, bringing in Flores, bringing in Weaver, a lot of people think, hey, is that kind of like an early look into who they might hire as defensive coordinator? And I think that is certainly possible. Now, Weaver certainly seems to have a lot of interest around the league for head coaching positions. He's a finalist for the Cardinals job. I'm sure he's not going to consider any defensive coordinator opportunities until the head coaching market dries up. But, if he really likes this Steelers defense and, he wouldn't mind, being a defensive coordinator for this team under Mike McCarthy, I think Anthony Weaver brings a lot of energy, a lot of juice. He's worked with Jalen Ramsey before, and Ramsey's really complimentary of him and his coaching style. I know the Giants with John Harbaugh, will be in the mix for Weaver as well for defensive coordinator because Weaver coached under Harbaugh in Baltimore. So, I certainly would like Weaver as the defensive coordinator here in Pittsburgh, but maybe some of the connections that Weaver has elsewhere make him a little bit less likely. Then you get Aubrey Pleasant, who's currently the DB coach of the Rams. He's also Sean McVay's assistant head coach. So Pleasant is somebody that's gotten some defensive coordinator interviews this cycle. And if you want that kind of Chris Shula style defense, so to speak, where, you're not blitzing a whole lot, but you're doing a lot of stunts. They've done a really good job with the defensive back talent that they've gotten in there in Los Angeles. They turned around the career of Cam Curl. They turned around the career of Emmanuel Forbes, both of which kind of fizzled out in Washington. And, they come to LA and they're a part of a top 10 defense now. So I would certainly look at Aubrey Pleasant as well if you like the defensive structure that Chris Shula brings to the table. And then a final one here to keep your eye on is Nick Rallis, who is the former defensive coordinator for the Cardinals under Jonathan Gannon. People in the league just rave about Rallis. He's a super young guy. He's in his 30s. But, really the defensive structure in Arizona was pretty good. Like they did run a very modern, match-based defense there in Arizona. So Nick Rallis is another name to keep your eye on there. But now that we're past 20 minutes already, I want to thank each and every one of you guys for stopping by here. Let me know who your preferred defensive coordinator candidate is for the Pittsburgh Steelers here. There's a number of guys that I would find acceptable, but if I'd have to pick one guy out of this entire crop that I would like to bring in, I would say Daronte Jones would be my number 1 pick. Bringing in that Brian Flores style defense, I think would work wonders here in Pittsburgh. Jones seems like somebody that's a really bright young mind that's worked with, DBs and all these different things that, I think would work really well here in Pittsburgh. I would certainly, accept a number of these candidates that we've talked about today, but I do think Daronte Jones would probably be my pick if I'm the new Steelers head coach. So later today, like I mentioned, I will be putting out a video when it comes to offensive coordinator candidates, but make sure you guys let me know your preferred defensive coordinator pick for the Steelers down there in the comment section. Make sure you click that subscribe button if you haven't already. Until next time, guys, here we go, Steelers.